Hello and welcome to our very first online GDG Cape Town meetup, which we have titled Mixed Bag. First of all, we'd really just like to give a huge thank you to Pamela Hill and the GDG Joburg chapter. Without their support, this online event might not have been possible. So today we're going to be talking about Android 11, dependency injection, and native cross-platform development on Huawei. Okay, and just to explain what we're about. Okay, so we're an official Google Developer Group chapter. Okay, and we're self-organized and independent, but supported by Google and our previous sponsors, namely Over, Luno, OfferZen, Flat Circle, FlameLink, Nomanini, and others. Feel free to talk to us about future speakers or topics or sponsorships. And then while the event is going on tonight, feel free to actually post your comments in the chat window below, and we will actually be able to see them and address them. So, who are the organizers? Well, we're made up of Maia Grotepass, Sylvia Dickman, George Ngete, Adrian Bunge, and me, Ahmed Tikua. And then just to information on how to get in touch with us. On Twitter, the handle is GDG Cape Town, so at GDG Cape Town. Our email address is gdgcapetown@gmail.com. On Meetup, you can find us at meetup.com/Google Developer Group Cape Town Meetup. And our Zartec, which is a Slack group, Slack channel, is #GDGCPT. Or you can ping one of the organizers. And then today's agenda. So we're going to have Maia Grotepass, who's going to be giving us a talk on Hilt versus Koin, practical comparison. And then we're going to have Adrian Bunge giving us the Huawei Google breakup, what's broken, and how you could fix your native or cross-platform app. And then after that, it's closing. Then code of conduct, just one simple thing, be nice. So now we're going to introduce Maia. Hey, Maia.
Hey.
Okay, so Maia is going to give us her first talk, which is going to be on Hilt versus Koin. Maia, over to you.
Okay, Ahmed. Welcome, everybody. My name is Maia Grotepass. I'm an Android dev at Luno, and I'm just going to take you to my next slide. So at this point, I would introduce myself. I'm an Android dev at Luno, and I would have a question into the audience to ask who's used dependency injection by show of hands, who's used Koin, who's used Dagger, who's looked at Hilt. But since I can't see you, if you've got any questions, please type them into chat. Okay, so just to get a start. So what is dependency injection? Well, dependency injection is just a software pattern. And all that it says is that any given object, if you instantiate an object, everything that the object needs to be passed into the constructor, for instance, or it just means that the object needs to get whatever it needs elsewhere, and it mustn't actually instantiate any of the objects. And so there's no local construction, and it's also called inversion of control because the object that you're creating doesn't know how to build the parts that it depends on. So what this makes is that you've got this kind of relationship. So here I've got a view model. It needs a repository. It doesn't derive or inherit from anything. It has a repository, and it actually gets this repository in through its constructor. Okay. So why would we need something like dependency injection? Well, it gives us loose coupling, which means that you can change the things that the object requires without the object knowing about it, and it makes for a better design. It's easier to change things. Also, from a testing point of view, if you're passing in the objects through the constructor, it's easier to test. So even without a framework, if you're doing that, you're going to have an easier time testing. Then if you're using some other form of framework, it reduces the cognitive load because you set up once how the objects are constructed, and then in the rest of your code, you don't have to worry about it. You just pull the object that you need from the dependency injection framework. And if you've got a framework, it can also reduce boilerplate. Okay, so if you're looking at dependency injection, the first thing that would pop up if you're searching is Dagger. So you'll see Dagger come up, and just a little bit of a backstory. In set theory and mathematics, there's a thing called the directed acyclic graph. And this is just a graph that doesn't loop back on itself. And it's particularly useful for representing. So you can see this picture. I got this from Wikipedia. This one depends, the dependencies flow like this, and there's no circular dependency. So this is a really useful mathematical construct to use to represent dependencies of software. But of course, if you say, yes, that sounds good, I like a graph like that, but that's not anything practical that you can use in your code yet. So then if you continue to search Dagger and you're thinking about building Dagger, then this happens. So the first time you start looking at Dagger, you'll see Dagger and you'll see Android Dagger. And then you'll start seeing examples with thermosiphons and coffee makers. And then you're wondering which one to use. And there are all sorts of annotations. And at that point, I usually go, I just want to actually build my feature. And of course, with all these coffee maker things, I start thinking about coffee. So to cut a path through all this word salad, for this talk, I'm going to take 3 possible paths. The first one is the manual path. And I've put an asterisk there because it can be pure dependency injection, but depending on how you build it, you might end up not having a pure dependency injection solution. The next one that pops up is Koin. There are others as well, but Koin looks like it's really simple. And there's a double asterisk there because strictly speaking, that isn't strictly dependency injection, but we'll get into that in a minute. And then, of course, Dagger. And now lately, if you start searching with the Android 11 libraries, you'll see that Hilt pops up as well. So those are the 3 things I'm going to look at in this talk. Okay, so, and also, it's difficult for me to understand how these things work if I don't have a practical example. So I'll take an example that I used in a previous talk. It's a simple toy app. It's an 8-ball app. You ask it a question and it answers the question with an 8-ball answer. The other thing it can do, though, it's not quite that simple. It can also give you a synonym. So if you type in how do you do, hello, it might say how do you do. And to get the synonym, it actually goes onto the internet, queries an API and comes back with a synonym. It can also, if you say password, it can generate a password, or if you type in a number, it can tell you if it's prime or not. So you can see that this question and answer thing, it's not just a simple question and answer thing. It's got network connections. It's got some calculations that it can do, just to make it a little bit more complicated. So if I look at the architecture of this app, right, it's pretty simple. There's an activity that's not that intelligent. All it does is does the view things. Then I've got a view model that prepares everything, that can see when a question gets asked and can provide answers to the activity. Then this view model needs a question repository. So the view model doesn't actually know anything about the questions. It's just got this question repository. And in the question repository, it can look at the question and decide, does it need to go on the network to fetch a password, or must it fetch a synonym, or must it do a calculation, or must it just ask the 8-ball? So if you look at this architecture, the obvious places to put in dependency injection is here at the repository. So the constructor of the repository would take these objects. Again, the view model can take, in its constructor, can take this repository. And then the activity needs a view model. Now, of course, we all know you can't inject things via constructor into the activity. So there is potentially an issue around how are we going to do this if I implement it manually, but we'll have a look and see what the possibilities are. Okay, so I can implement patterns. Let me code it up. So what I do is I use constructor injection. And since I'm using Kotlin, I can use constructor parameters and default parameters. So the default parameters would be the default implementation of what I want for the repositories. And then if I need to insert marks in test, I can instantiate the objects and just insert marks where I need to. Okay, now for the activity field injection. So I can't insert anything in the constructor of the activity. So typically what I could do, either I could make a static object and then make a caller method in the static object or reach something through the static object, or I can make an object inside my application so that when the activity starts up, I can ask the application to provide me the things that I need. Now this, the minute you're making a method call out at runtime, it's no longer the strict formal definition of dependency injection anymore. So this is the first asterisk I had on the previous slide. So what does this look like here? This part over here, at the constructor of the repository, this is pretty easy. Just use Kotlin with default parameters, and then in the test insert mocks. The same with the view model. And the activity, there's an application with a container object, and you can insert this here. I'm not going to show a lot of code on these slides, but there is a matching repo with all the examples in branches, but I'll give you the links to that at the end of the talk. So that's the manual scenario. So now looking at Koin. So what are the main features of Koin? It's not really dependency injection. It's more what they call a service locator pattern, which is similar to calling the application and asking for the things you need, except it's in a library. So it's a service locator pattern in a library. That's just the definitions. It doesn't have any annotations or code generation. So it's all Kotlin. It's got this DSL that you set up. So you set up your things using the DSL, and then you can just get the objects when you need them. It knows about view models, so it can inject view models into activities. And it also knows about Android application context. So if you need an application context in any one of your objects, you can pass that in. Also, it's got modules, so you can break things up. You don't need only one module, and it's got support for integration tests. So I want to say something about tests here. If you create the object and you pass in all of its dependencies in the constructor, this already makes your tests better and easier, because your unit tests, you can just use that without a framework. So you can use Koin with, you can set up Koin, and then in your unit tests, you don't even need to use Koin. You can just pass in the mocks and the constructors. But if you want to run integration tests and you maybe want to mock up the network or something else, there are Koin features that you can use to set up those integration tests. Okay, so what would this diagram look like? So inside your application, you just run a piece of code which says start Koin. There's DSL for that. I'll show you an example. You create a module which has all these, which explains how all of these things are instantiated. And then in your activity, if you need a view model, you just say buy view model, and it will populate it correctly. Or if you need something else that's not a view model, you can just say buy inject. And so then in your activity, you'll get hold of the object that you need. In the view models constructor, all you need to do, if it's a simple object like this question repository, all you need to do is call this get method, and it will go into Koin and get you the thing that you need. So this question repository has got multiple things over here, and some of these things have similar interfaces. So if you've got like a problem like that where Koin can't see which of these two things you need, you can give it a named one. So you can actually say, give me an 8-ball, or give me a synonym, or give me a password object. So that's the way you would insert these things into your architecture. So this is the little piece of code that goes inside the application. You just go start Koin. There you can see it's an Android context you can add. And then the modules method here like this, you just pass it module objects, and inside the module objects, it explains how the objects are created. So this is what the module would look like. I'm not going to go into too much detail, but just suffice to say, you can go single. So to get a singleton, you can have factories. And here you can see how the name thing works. So I'm saying that if I want an 8-ball, give me this object. And if I want a question repository, then pass in this 8-ball object and this parameter. So this is a typical Koin module. So now at this point, you would say, well, this isn't really strictly dependency injection anymore, it's service locator. And if you look up the service locator on the internet, you'll find that people say the problem with that is that it's at runtime, there are going to be issues. You might have, the dependencies might not be, the graph might not be correct, and then at runtime your app will crash. So to mitigate this, Koin has this module check test that you can run. It's a Koin test, and if you say check modules and you give it the modules, it will go through the modules and make sure that that it can actually resolve all of the objects. So to mitigate that, what you need to do is add this unit test into, oh, did I go backwards? You need to add this unit test into your unit tests to make sure everything is set up correctly. So just as a recipe, what would you do? Oh, things are going too quick. You need to add the library. You need to set up your application with that start coin and set up the manifest to use the application. You need to make the modules that you need for your app. You need to add constructor parameters to the objects that need them. And then if you need to inject a field, then you can use a get, or as a parameter, you can use this get method. You need to add this unit test to check that your modules can resolve. And then you can add to your integration tests and your unit tests as necessary. Okay, so now moving on to Hilt. So Hilt is the new kid on the block, sort of. Well, it's not. It's an old kid with new clothes. So it's built, underlying, it's still Dagger. It's the official consistent version that Google suggests at the moment. What consistent means is that when you were using Dagger, you sometimes found that different apps had different implementations of Dagger, and it could get confusing. And if you're moving between code bases, it always took a bit of time to get used to how the dependency injection was set up. So now, if you know how Hilt works, it's easier to get into to understand how things are working because it's consistent. It uses annotation, and it's got it defines set injection points, like those points on the architecture diagram that I showed. Those injection points you would just mark up with an annotation. And also, if you have providers, you annotate the providers. So because it's annotation, it means it's going to generate some code. So Koin doesn't generate code, but because we're using annotations here, Hilt needs to generate code. It's got a basic library for basic annotations, and then there's another Android X library that allows you to access view models or inject view models. And then the other thing that's great about Hilt is it knows about activities, fragments, views, services, broadcast receivers, and context. So it knows how to inject, it knows how to set those objects up so that you can inject into them. And also, if you need a context, you can access an Android context. And then it's got code to support for integration tests. So this is for when, for instance, if you're doing an integration test and you don't want to access the network, you want to mock the network out. So there is support for that. And then one of my favorite two features is it has fantastic IDE support. So you can literally see in the gutter of the IDE, you can navigate around the dependency injection tree, and it's got a great cheat sheet, which I will also show shortly. So let's look at this diagram again. So your application, you don't need to add any code at all. All you need to do is annotate your application with Hilt Android app. If you don't have complex modules, you don't need to provide the modules. You can just use this inject on the constructor to indicate that an object like that is going to be injected. At the view model point, you just annotate your view model with at view model inject. And then your activity you annotate with Android entry point, and then wherever you want a field, you go at inject, and you can get the field that you need. So why would you use the module? In this particular case here, these objects have a similar interface, and it's difficult for the dependency injection framework to understand which one I want when I'm constructing this object. So in the modules, you can say exactly how you want this to be constructed. Okay, so here's a piece of code that's inside a module. There is a bit more code. This is not a complete module, but this is, for instance, how you would do. If I wanted one of these question repositories, it needs 8-ball password synonym, and I made these annotation things to explain how to construct these objects. Now, this dispatcher provider, it's a simple object, and all you need to do for it is mark it up with inject at the constructor, and Hilt will find this and be able to inject this like this. And so when you want one of these repositories, this is the construction of it over here, and then you just use app provides. And if it's a singleton, you can say it's a singleton. Okay, so the recipe for Hilt would be add the library, set up the application and the manifest with this single annotation, make a module if you need it, set up the constructors of the objects that need to be injected with @inject, and then for field injection, you just use the inject method. You can use the inject method for field injection as well. Add your integration tests if you need to, and then the unit tests are the same way the unit tests are in any case. So I'm just going to go back one slide because what I wanted to see if I can see, oh, I cut off. So the IDE integration would give you an icon over here in the gutter, and if you click that, it would just jump to the correct object that you want to inject at any one point. Okay, so now contrast and compare. So the manual method, it's 0 bytes big, except for your own code. It's simple. You can get started quickly. You don't need any extra libraries. There's no code generation. The cons, however, are that you have the boilerplate for the factories, which you repeat all of your code, potentially. If you want to have objects that are only constructed, say, with an activity and not for the application, you've got to start managing those objects yourself, which means you need to know when to clear them, which means you sometimes would get weird bugs if you don't understand the life cycle and you don't know how to release the memory properly. And you need an object or an application if you want to do injection inside your activity. And it can turn into the service locator anti-pattern. I don't know if that is an issue for you, then that's one of the things, one of the cons. If I'm looking at Koin adds 600 bytes to your APK, not huge, but something. The pros are it's easy to get started. It's pretty easy to understand. In concept, it's closer to the manual implementation. There's a simple DSL. It can handle multiple modules, so you don't need to worry about instantiating objects at different lifecycle points. There's no code generation. There's no reflection, so it's not going to affect your build at all. The cons are it is that service locator anti-pattern, and you could get runtime errors if you don't add that check to your unit tests. So now Hilt adds 41 bytes, which I'm not sure what's in there, but it does. The pros are it's Android official, it's built on Dagger, but it's easier to use. So there's none of those complex Dagger things to code up. You can literally just sprinkle your code with annotations and it should hook in the Dagger things. There's the IDE support. It's Android aware, so it knows about activities and view models. And the other thing, which I didn't show, but it's build type aware as well. So that means you can inject different things for, say, a debug build or a production build, or if you've got different flavors. It coexists with Dagger. So if you find that there's something in Hilt that you can't do, or you had something special that you wanted to do, you can still do it in the Dagger way. So that means you can have the complexity of Dagger. And also, if you've already got Dagger, the migration from Dagger to Hilt is pretty easy because it's just underlying, it's still Dagger. And there's the cheat sheet. So the cons for Hilt is that it's in alpha at the moment. So it's not, so if your app has a problem with it being in alpha, then that could be a potential reason why you wouldn't jump on Hilt now. And also it's an annotation processor and it generates code. So this could make your build slower depending on how your build is set up. Okay. So which one would you use? If it's a really small toy app, I would roll my own. If it's a medium to large app and you can't use Hilt, so that's before Hilt, I would consider Koin. Or if you think that you need it, you can investigate Dagger. If you can use Hilt and you're happy to use the alpha library, I would definitely go for Hilt. So maybe from that perspective, if it's a medium to large app, I would look at Dagger because I know I can possibly migrate to Hilt later. And then what if you already have Dagger in your code base? Well, I'd leave it alone. Or you can migrate to Hilt because you can have both of them at the same time. So here, I can take questions. And I also wanted to, let me just escape here quick and show you what the cheat sheet looks like. So this is the cheat sheet for Hilt. And you can see it's really nicely broken up with what the annotation is, where you would use it, and some code samples. So it's got all of the annotation that Hilt uses in that cheat sheet. And if you look at the documentation for Hilt, it will show you a link to this cheat sheet. Okay, let's just go back here. All right. So this is where all of the code for this is. It's in my GitHub repo and it's called Hello 8 Ball. So this is a previous example that I had before. It's got lots of tests, and it actually tests the whole, it unit tests the whole view model and all of the objects. So the manual dependency injection or the constructor injection is on the master branch. If you're looking at how to set up Koin, it's in the Koin branch. And if you want to see how Hilt is set up, it's in the Hilt branch. And all of these branches, the steps for the recipe are in individual check-ins in those branches. Okay, Ahmed, I can take questions now.
Alrighty. Okay, so we actually just only have two questions, and the first one is from Pamela, which is please ask the 8-ball whether Hilt is really the best DI for science.
I think the 8-ball's going to say yes.
Okay, and then the second question, which was posted by Peter van der Vijver, is Koin versus Code-in.
I haven't messed around with Code-in much. I was going to investigate it, but then when I started looking at Hilt makes life so much easier. And the fact that if you do need something more complicated, you can with Hilt. I probably won't even bother to look at Code-in now.
Okay. Yeah, those are the only questions.
Okay.
Yeah. Thank you so much for a great talk, Maia.
Okay.
Thank you. All right. So next, we're going to be moving on to Adrian, who's going to be giving us his talk. Hey, Adrian.
Cool. Hey.
Hey. Alrighty.
Yeah, we're starting a little early, so I hope that some of the peeps are here.
Okay.
Also, my connection has been a little iffy, so if you can't hear me so well, just let me know. So yeah, So as I was saying, just let me know if you can't hear me, and I'll just repeat myself. And yeah, I hope everyone that I told is here, because I thought I was only going to speak at 1:45, but yeah, we'll see how it goes. Right, so I'm going to be speaking today about the Google Huawei breakup. Basically, I'm just going to cover up roughly what's happening, and then what does it mean for us as devs. And then, first of all, just a little background on myself. I'm a self-taught developer, and I started on Android. I transitioned to React Native and picked up React Web recently. And I've been working for Nona, but contracted to a large media company because I'm not allowed to say anything more than that, sadly. But yeah, cool. So what's been happening? Let me give you guys the quick synopsis. So I'm sure everybody's heard about the whole 5G scandal and how Huawei has allegedly put in some backdoor entries, which means that they could monitor various connections and so on. Recently, the UK, but Huawei now having some questions as well about whether or not to allow Huawei to do their 5G infrastructure. So I recently found out that Eric Schmidt, who used to be the pre-CEO of Google, is now working for the US Department of Defense as his main job and no longer for Google, which seems to indicate that Google had a pretty within the case. But yeah, anyway, interesting times. So on the China side, Huawei is a government-backed company and is one of the biggest and best, actually, device manufacturers in the world. Their hardware is really good. I tried one of their laptops once, also amazing hardware that they're building. And anyway, they are huge in China, but just how big are they? They had 520 million users last year, this in the first quarter, and compared to 650 million, the number has basically doubled. And the number of apps that use their basically alternative to Google is up by 67%. So pretty big numbers. And yeah, so basically what I'm just trying to say is I think the tech Cold War has begun, and we're gonna be in for quite interesting times, I think. I think things are going to get a bit crazy, but yeah. Anyway, before I continue, I am on Twitter, so if you want to get me, my handle's at the bottom of the screen over there. So feel free to tweet at me if you want to continue the conversation. And also, if you have any questions while I get into the more nitty-gritty things, please post them into the comments, and then Ahmed will then post them onto the screen, and I'll then answer them. So yeah, more than welcome to keep it as interactive as possible. Okay, so what does this breakup mean for us? Well, on the surface level, it means that there are going to be a lot of Android phones that no longer have the Play Store on them. So that means that you now have to put your app into the Huawei store, which is called App Gallery. So that's like significant, but perhaps more significant is that we cannot use a lot of Google software anymore in our apps. So for that go onto Huawei phones. If the Play Store, for those of you who don't know, the Play Store has a whole lot of software in it that apps would then use to do a particular thing. So right, so wait, where am I? Oh, wait, oh, shoot, okay, sorry. All right, so let's go through platform by platform, what this means for us, and then we'll kind of round it all up. So we'll start with Android because that's where it kind of makes sense. That's where you're the basic layer, right? So that's where we're writing natively in the language that Android best understands, right? So yeah. So what are the things that kind of don't work? Well, GCM location doesn't work anymore because you don't have Google Maps, and because you don't have Google Maps, you don't have location. So you basically have to use an alternative. I believe some Jetpack packages will probably no longer work anymore, but I haven't tested that stuff yet, and ads won't work. All of this stuff, mind you, I have tested in some of the apps that I've been working with, but your mileage may vary because, yeah, sometimes things worked, some things didn't work. Most significantly, though, on native Android, a lot of the Firebase stuff doesn't work anymore. Because Firebase has got a very strong linkage to the Google, Google mobile services. So the things that don't work are Crashlytics. So basically, what Crashlytics is, it tells us developers whether or not the app has crashed. So whether or not the app has disappeared from the screen and say that it's crashed, you know, that's kind of where we then find out what's working and what isn't. So basically, at the moment, unless you have another service, you're basically flying blind because you're not getting any data from the phones that have your app installed on it, even if you have your app in the Huawei App Gallery. Another thing that doesn't work, and this is a big one, is people say differently, but from my tests, it does. Auth doesn't work at all, which is quite sad. Again, if you're using the Firebase Android native SDKs, database, I saw that it worked once, but if you need Firebase Auth to get the data out of database onto your app, then obviously it doesn't work. So that sucks. But we can use Kotlin, so that's a plus. So if you want to, this is just a little tip, if you want to see whether or not your package is depending on a Google GSM package, so one of the things that won't be there, you can actually just go onto the Maven repository website, which is really cool. And it just, yeah, it can show you what your app is depending on. I did find, however, that there are like packages, like I mentioned previously, like database, which kind of worked, but it has dependencies on Play services. So yeah, I don't know. It's a bit of a weird one. Anyway, so what can you do to combat this on native Android? Well, you can use Huawei's HMS. So HMS is Huawei Mobile Services, basically the plug and play, not really, but the hopeful plug and play replacement for GMS. But yeah, so they do have maps, but quite limited capabilities. The way that the software is designed is like very it's a bit sketchy and a bit limited, and yeah. Anyway, we'll get more into that a bit later. So on the Firebase side for Crashlytics, again, there is an HMS package for Crashlytics. I haven't integrated it myself, so I can't really speak for it, but it is there, and that's kind of an unavoidable one, unfortunately, that you do have to do, and notifications as well, you're going to have to go that route. However, Firebase does give you REST. So for those of you who are not too familiar, we have these things called SDKs, which are software development kits. So it's a piece of software that we install that then allows us to do things much more easily. But those kits are based on a more fundamental thing, which is called REST. So REST is a more direct way to communicate with Firebase. And with that more direct way, we can then basically make commands and get data back and interact Firebase like that. But that's just quite cumbersome and quite slow, and you don't really want to do that. The other alternative is that you can wrap up some of your functionality that you have clients and call that with a REST or an HTTP call, as we call it, and then it will then run the code. So you could wrap up analytics or auth or contact the database. It just means that you have to write a lot of code and you lose a lot of the convenience that Firebase normally gives us. So pretty much wraps up the Android native side of things. There are probably many other packages and that I haven't mentioned here, but this is just, again, the surface level. If you have any other questions or you've had your own experience, please do pop a question in the comments or a statement. I haven't seen any questions in the comments so far, but yeah, cool. Right. So web. Well, this is where life gets a bit better. It's totally unaffected. So that's a big plus. Because their SDK is JavaScript, they can't to connect to things. So that's and so yeah, I guess that makes sense. And because it's a browser, you don't need the Play Store. And because you don't need the Play Store, you don't need GCM, and so you can do a whole lot of things. I mean, obviously, things like location and stuff like that are limited on the web, so that's why those things don't come into play. Right, cross-platform. So let me just have a sip of water here. All right. News is so Let me explain React Native in 2 sentences or more. React Native is basically a way that you can write apps that have a very good performance using Java and using the JavaScript SDKs to interact with Firebase, then your life is good. So Firebase Auth, real-time, and Firestore and analytics, your life is peachy. And so that's really nice. I think that's on the next slide. But so let me get native modules have a dependency on GSM. So let's okay, I'll answer that question shortly. Just give me a moment. So the native where was I now? So the native modules that have a dependency on Google mobile services won't work. So let's say you have something that wraps up Google Maps or location into a native module, let's say, I don't know, geofencing or something like that, and you export that to your JavaScript object, then obviously that's not going to have to work. Other news is, if you're using this library called React Native, this out the way, because it depends on native packages as opposed to where open source SDK for Firebase that can be used outside of Google SDKs. So the thing is like, are you saying that there should be an SDK that wraps up REST API calls into an easily and more accessible tool? Then no, that doesn't exist at the moment. Not one that uses web in any case. React Native Firebase is open source, but it depends on Firebase to be able to interact with Firebase. You can, of course, go and not use Firebase at all and do your own backend system. I don't know, use Mongo, use whatever. Those options are still totally open to you to be able to do. But yeah, cool. I kind of hope that answered your question. Right. So the bad news for React Native is that crash reporting and notifications are still affected. Because notifications are a native thing, and because notifications are a thing that is provided through the Play Store or Google Mobile Services, that's out. So you have to use the Huawei push kit, which, again, it was very similar to how Google does things, so they've done a good job of that, I guess. So bash them if it's going to make my life okay. Crash reporting, again, this is a bad news thing because we're flying blind. With an app that I was working on, we thought life was all good because we weren't seeing any crashes in Crashlytics, and the device models in Firebase of the newer Huawei phones, they're not to be found. So awkward. I do also have it on good authority that Huawei is going to start pushing very hard in Africa with their mobile devices and push them at very cheap prices. So yeah, it's probably worth thinking about trying to support this kind of stuff. Anyway, so Flutter. Yeah, so you have the same problems with the native dependencies. If your kind of module has a dependency like on Maps, on Google Maps, then it's not going to work. If your app opens up a YouTube video, that's not going to work. You're going to have to open it up into a web view and then show the video. And that's not so bad, but it's possible. The thing with Flutter is that you can't use JavaScript. So you can't do that little hack that I was talking about with the web SDK. That unfortunately won't work. So you're going to have to use REST, and you're going to have to use Cloud Function. So yeah, I mean, I would say that's a pretty significant con that I only of Flutter that I only for this talk. Yeah. So life is easiest if you're on web. Life is okay if you're on React Native. Life is hard if you're on native Android, and hardest if you're on Flutter. Final words before I get onto like some tinfoil hat questions, but maybe we can actually do other questions first. But anyway, so Google and Huawei are unlikely to get back together again. Tons of people and resources to this problem. I mean, it's pretty staggering. Like, the Huawei support people have been so efficient. If I have a question or something, quite amazing, maybe a little bit rashy even, but they're on it. So if you need help, let me know, and I will put you in direct contact. I've been working with. They're on it. But I think, considering they've only had like a year and they have to replicate a lot of what Google's doing, it's quite impressive. So like that you keep getting signed out. Which is really annoying. And like also the can be a bit tricky, but again, totally doable, totally possible. It's not too crazy. So a final thought, like, China has so many users, going to be pushing super hard into developing countries. I mean, if they have basically 650 million users, that's pretty staggering. You would be foolish, I think, not to try Huawei. But yeah, so things to think about. Yeah, that's pretty much me. I have some tinfoil hat questions first. Yeah, welcome to ask anything in the chat.
Yeah, so there aren't any questions at the moment, except for that one earlier about the SDK. Are there any more questions, guys? Remember to put them in the comments. Nah, doesn't look like it, Adrian.
Okay, cool. So then I'll get on to my tinfoil hat questions or thoughts. And here's a question. Is it nobler or better to have the USA spying on you or China? Just a question, because as an Android developer, I kind of got a view into what was possible with apps not so long ago, like location tracking and that kind of stuff. And until like, what was it? Android, what was after Marshmallow? Yeah, Nougat. Up until Nougat, there was a yeah, up until Nougat, you had to track somebody's location. You were able to have the user's camera on without them even knowing. So Facebook could totally have been watching you, your facial reactions and your eye movement according to how you scroll on the feed. So much was possible with the USA spying. Different to have China doing it, but yeah, I saw that now there is a question. Android is hard. Do you have any experience using the HMS converter tool? Apparently, you can convert your Android native code base in minimal time. So I tried the converter tool. let me explain how I see that it works. So in essence, what it does is that it creates an additional module in your app, which then if you call a certain method, so if you call a certain Google method that isn't available, then it will rather, if the Play Store isn't there, then it will use that method. And I tried it out, and it was a the code that it generated to do that stuff was a little bit difficult to understand. Yeah, I think for like larger production apps, it's going to be hard to use that tool. But there are things that you can do along the way that can make your life easier. Like I said, using a web view to show your YouTube video if you have YouTube videos in your app. So that is possible. But yeah, I don't know. I didn't find that converter app very useful. But, you know, like I say, things are moving very fast at Huawei at the moment. And one should probably keep an eye to see if that converter tool gets better. But yeah, for me, it, you know, you would want something to work and then it doesn't. Like they don't have autocomplete for places. So like, let's say you were having to type in your town to get weather for your for where you live in your app, then you can't do that even with their converter tool because they don't actually have that functionality built yet. So yeah, that's, you know, they only have maps. They don't have that autocomplete places thing. So I hope that that answers your question. Try it, see if it works for you, but I wasn't too hopeful about it. Cool. So they, only taking privacy seriously right now. What about before? Yeah, I don't know, man. Like, it's I don't know who's better to spy on us, to be honest with you. And I think because of Africa's context, because we are very happy to take help from China, I think Huawei is pretty much here to stay. Yeah, that's my thoughts. Yeah, any other last minute questions? Very happy to help y'all out.
No other questions.
Very happy to help you guys out.
Only a comment, I guess, from Martin Trollope. So the same experience with the tool for large apps, it became impossible to use the HMS.
Yeah. The kits was very confusing, guys, and also the permissions. Just whoever is in charge of your app, just ask them to give you administrative access to the highest level permission to enable kits and stuff. So yeah, that's a good. You want to just like enable all the organizers so you can like save it.
Yes. Cool.
Oh.
All right. All right. So this is all of us here.
Thanks for joining us.
The organizing team. Yeah. So any words, guys?
Yeah, just thanks for the audience for being here for our first online GDG. And if you've got any questions, you can question us on Twitter, or if you want to talk about a particular topic, or you want us to look at something, or you have a topic that you want to talk about, then just connect with us and then we'll make it happen.
Cool. Still there?
So.
Wow.
All right.
Cool.
Guys, thank you so much for joining us.
Awkward, guys.
talk. And Adrian, thank you so much for the talk on the Huawei Google breakup. It was very insightful and helpful. And yes, until next time, guys, thank you for joining us. Cheers.